one of the things we talked about was the challenge that the forest inventory data is, really lacks the level of detail and specificity in terms of, the geography that, something like maybe LiDAR might provide. And, so there's limits to how that forest inventory data could be used at scales smaller than like a county, where a lot of, at scales where we're talking about trying to develop wildlife habitat types of recommendations, or wildlife habitat types of monitoring or models, so that was one of the discussion points that we had.
Thanks, Eric. Amanda, go ahead.
Thanks. Our group started off by kind of reflecting on some of the cool take-home ideas that we've gained from this summit so far. Just that whole theme of good enough, and of course Goldilocks and everything. But thinking about how does that apply to that 2017 kind of priority statement that was made. Our discussion kind of, since I'm not from Minnesota, the rest of my group educated me a little bit about how things work. And what was cool is that we had folks that worked in different landscapes. And so this sort of tied into the group I was in yesterday. So to answer the question of, what does it mean in terms of how we manage our lands, and how do we agree and make some change? I think in all the different landscapes that our group is working in, there's an opportunity to build public trust and to engage with people, landowners, whether you're, if you're working with, forest landowners, or the public if they're visiting your parks, or, constituents that are part of the North Shore, just to try to get folks to understand a little bit more about what the changes are that are happening, or that might be good to have happen on the landscape. And so doing that sort of on the more local scale can help build into that kind of broader mission statement about managing for the range of cover types, patch sizes, and age class distributions needed to sustain diversity. And that all, of course, ties back to the Aloe Leopold and keeping all the cogs and pieces if you're going to be doing some intelligent tinkering. So if across the landscape we can keep all those cogs, we'll be in good shape.
Great, well said. Thanks, Amanda. I'm sure there was a lot of other stuff discussed. Who wants to share anything that was discussed in your group? What else? Again, you can click the participants tab at the bottom of your screen and then raise your hand. And if you're not finding how to do that, then just unmute yourself, but and go for it. But first, let's hear from, I see Peter Deeser and then Ryan Rothstein. So Peter, you're on.
Hey, Eli. So yeah, we kind of bounce back and forth a little bit because it can be within the context of some of our previous discussions, that porridge is just right might change depending on what you might have this, a good idea of what you want to do on the ground in specific site or in a small neighborhood scenario. But it's important to take account of what's happening next door, and those elevation considerations really fluctuate as you're trying to make those management decisions. So, and at the end of the day, there are some challenges to getting certain work done in certain areas. So, just making sure that you're doing a lot of that quality work when you might never get to what you think is a perfect goal, but having that emphasis on a quality approach and engaging those partners when possible is really key. And setting up those collaboratives was a challenge. It's easy to sometimes manage in your small area, but that collaborative approach where you're really trying to make a landscape level improvement or impact can really be a challenge, and often takes kind of a bulldog scenario where you're doing your best to or a few people are, to really facilitate that conversation, because it's so easy for it to slide onto someone's back burner. And we're learning so much that some of the challenges and opportunities that are coming in the future, are dependent on our expanding knowledge base, our ability to do work on the ground, our ability to set up those collaborative opportunities, and understand that challenges may change or magnify over time as resource needs grow or change. And as other considerations come into play, such as changing climates or the affected, ecological community changes that may be associated with them. So it's important too, in the context of all of this, to hear kind of those primers again and go back to the basics sometimes, so that we can remember, what's important to consider on a number of different levels from a number of different life cycle needs approaches for suites of species, so that we can get quality habitat on the ground.
Great, thanks, Peter. Ryan, go ahead and unmute, you're on.
This is kind of a nice segue from what Peter was just saying, but one of the big things that we talked about just on a broader overarching level is to really have any sort of impact on more of a landscape level, you absolutely have to include private landowners in it, because that's the majority of the land base. And, a big part of what I see and what I've heard others say is that there's a huge disconnect, because the level of knowledge that's in this group here with what I hear from actual private landowners. And another big thing we discussed is how the habitat knowledge, so to speak, has kind of been usurped by outdoors media, things like hunting shows or some private consultants that maybe aren't the best qualified to be giving habitat advice. And just kind of how do we get that knowledge and that outreach to the private landowners so that they're getting the best information possible. Not that it's just barstool biology going on out there, but how do we engage more private landowners and try to coordinate more of this stuff on a regional level rather than just on a county by county where it can kind of get disjointed. So I'm not sure that we really came up with any solutions, but we had a good talk about how we can do a better job of reaching some of these goals by trying to engage these private landowners better.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, Dave Garcelis, go ahead. Oh, wait a minute, your hand was up. Go ahead, Dave, if you had something you wanted to say.
Yeah, I just lowered my hand.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, I figured out how to do both. Yeah, following from what Ryan said, because our group also went off in that direction. And we started with the issue of, okay, we want to save everything. We can't monitor everything. And how do you do that? So how do you prevent stuff from disappearing if you're not monitoring everything? And there's a lot of species that you don't see very often. They're hard to see. You just don't notice them when you're walking through the forest, and they can disappear, or their populations can drop down to 10% of what they were, and nobody will ever know. And as agency people, we're not concerned with a lot of those species, and so they just kind of get forgotten. So one of the solutions was, yeah, we have to involve more people. There might be a student out there or a special project out there. But the other solution was, as Ryan said, is all the citizens that are out there, because there are people that are writing stuff down and noticing stuff that's happening either in a public place or on their private land. And it might be that they have trail camera data, which would be great, but it might just be that they have notes that they've recorded for the past 40 years about stuff happening. And, there used to be such and such turtle in that pond and they've disappeared. And the big issue is we think that data is out there, but how to collect it, how to sort through it, how to determine what's legitimate. I mean, that's a massive undertaking. But I think that the data potentially exists, and it would be nice if somehow we could tap into it.
I'm really glad you said that, Dave. One thing that I've been thinking about a little bit, I've gotten involved on and off with iNaturalist. There are these platforms like iNaturalist that enable people to report what they've seen, whether it's invasive plants or that's very widely used, I think, for flowering species and for birds and maybe others. And some of those data sets, and they've done a pretty good job, I think, of offering ways to validate the data, and the data are not perfect, but In fact, we've kicked around some ideas, or I've been thinking about some ideas for programming for professional audiences to get folks using those tools, because I think especially for things like invasive species, they can get us, you all are crawling through the woods all over the place, and we really could get very good quality data on things like that. So yeah, good point, Dave, about those data sets and how to corral them. I know Rebecca Montgomery down at the U of M Department of Forest Resources has gotten some LCCMR money to collect some plant data, and I know that there's more we could do there. We've still got about 10 minutes for kind of discussions. So any additional thoughts? What else did you hear in your breakouts that we haven't yet discussed as a bigger group?
It sounded like someone was about to speak up right before you started, Eli. So
Oh,
whoever
sorry.
that was, if you want to go for it.
That was just me, and I was going to say the same thing. iNaturalist, we've been teaching classes on it. The master naturalists learn all about it now.
Yeah.
And it's very popular with the public. So I think that's a good way to keep pushing it. And then there is the invasive reporting one separate, Glidden or whatever. Great Lakes invasive one that I think is merging with the national invasive reporting.
Yeah.
And these are all apps that are
Ed
the
Maps
apps make
and
it so easy.
Glidden.
Ed Maps, yeah.
Yep.
So,
Great Lakes Early Detection Network. There are a variety of tools that are all plugged in. And my understanding is that, not to go too deep down the rabbit hole, but I think iNaturalist has strengthened its ties. I think it automatically reports invasives to Ed Maps and Glidden now. I think maybe they're not on exactly the same databases, but they're creating stronger linkages. So good things happening there. Thanks, Molly. Oh, Jessica, I just saw your hand. Go ahead, Jessica. You can unmute and speak up.
Hi there. I just noticed no one from our group got spoke up yet, so I thought I would just chime in. We focused a little bit. We kind of went towards like the opportunity portion of the discussion prompt, and we seem to identify a few specific opportunities, but talking about how that is can really add a lot of power to gaining not only funding but support publicly for different projects, and the more different special interest groups can come together for a certain purpose and trying to have a blanket incorporate the more species sorts of management that's going to encompass many species, I should say, is going to give a lot of strength to that. So, and I don't know if Lindsay wants to chime in about some of the specific things that we talked about.
Say, if I could, Eli, just one more thing I want to throw out there too, and anyone can feel free to interrupt me. I think one thing that what makes Minnesota's conservation community robust and get a lot of good things done on the ground is the fact that we have challenges about balancing wildlife and forestry needs, but we do have a vital timber industry that facilitates a lot of management in the forest. And as we discuss how to implement different types of wildlife habitat across the landscape, I think it's important to note that that this summit and a lot of what the collaborative does is facilitating the bridge between determining what those and implementing those wildlife resource needs and those timber resource needs. So, a lot of foresters have to work within the confines of a certain, resource need and within the context of, like those voluntary site level guidelines. So their porridge is kind of set at a certain temperature, and they then needed to take what they can do on that site and do the best what they, with some of the species guidance to work within their retention guidelines and all of that. So I think it's important to note how, it's great to hit this perfect taste or flavor or temperature, but it's also important to note that some people are constrained by what they can do on the ground. And it's important to help them understand what they can do within their wiggle room to get some quality work done on their sites.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Peter. All right, I am looking at my participants list. I'm not seeing any hands up. We do have a couple more minutes, so if one or two more people want to weigh in, we can, and if not, we can move on to our next speaker. I see one. Yeah, go ahead, Alexis. Great.
Hi, Eli. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to kind of follow up with what Dave was talking about the importance of monitoring. We also talked about that in our group. And especially when we're talking about putting habitat on the ground, there's really a lack of monitoring that goes on to see how effective that habitat management action might have been. And also we've been talking about managing for a broad suite of species, but there's not a lot of follow-up with that as well. And really that's what we need to move ahead with adaptive management plans as the ecosystems are changing, as the species distributions are changing. So I think really to start answering some of those questions, we need to be more innovative about how we structure some of the forest management implementation, and then also how we're monitoring the wildlife response to it, and then informing that adaptive management response.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alexis. Well, good. Thanks everybody for weighing in. It sounds like we had a good set of breakout discussions. And I appreciate that. Caitlin and I were talking about, gee, were our instructions too broad? Did we give them something specific enough to talk about? And it sounds like you did a good job of making sense of those broad questions. So thanks everybody for the discussions and for reporting out.